One thing that I regularly notice throughout all sorts of entertainment is that there'll always be people asking how others end up finding new things worth enjoying. For me, the solution is to keep your eyes and ears open in any and all places. I bring that up because I ended up discovering this game thanks to watching a Mother's Basement video. The video wasn't fully discussing video games, but he still ended up including footage of Ape Out. Since Ape Out is visually interesting, something that I'll eventually get into, it was easy to be drawn in by its appearance. Not only was it minimalist in a way that managed to stand out, its gameplay was also explosive and exciting to watch. I had no idea what the game was about or how much it cost, but I knew I had to look it up online. Thankfully, it ended up being affordable, so it was a must-buy for me. It's possible that some could be turned off by Ape Out's minimalist appearance, but that was one of the things that most appealed to me. It's one thing for minimalist art to be passed off in such a way that it comes off as more of a cop-out, but with Ape Out, that's not the case. Simply put, the art is very nice, and that's seen in more ways than one. In particular, I enjoyed how this was utilized with the gameplay itself. Maybe it's because of the number of times I played the classic Resident Evil games back when I was a kid, but I really like it when games change things depending on whether or not you're damaged. It's not only because it affects how the game handles, but also because it makes it clear that there are consequences for being damaged. In Resident Evil, it meant being slower and being more open to enemy attacks. In Ape Out, it meant leaving a trail of blood. I'm not entirely sure if that allowed enemies to be able to track you more easily, but its visual effects were enough to make me satisfied with how this was approached. It wasn't just with taking damage and leaving trails of blood. Since some levels are dark, it's difficult to tell how many enemies are around and where they are. To make things worse, enemies have lights that make it easy for them to spot you, whereas you can just barely see them, even if this could be frustrating when first encountered. I liked how the lights came in and out while blending in with the guard's flashlight. I thought it was a great way of messing with you. The point isn't for the devs to make the game hard in a cheap way, but I thought it was interesting and well done because it managed to work together with the game's art style. This isn't the first game to combine art with gameplay, but it did enough to stand out to me. Though there's definitely a lot that stands out after having played Ape Out, the combat was one of the game's aspects that most stood out to me. It's not only because you're playing as an aggressive ape, but also because it's a highly visual and violent game, even if done in a minimalist way. There's a lot that can be noticed soon after you start playing, but I saw how fun combo kills are. Ape Out doesn't feature a system meant to track your kills or even points, but you yourself can make it so that you can try to chain up as many kills as possible. For me, this was mainly by tossing guards into each other. One of the most basic ways that you can kill guards is to toss them into walls, but you eventually realize that you can toss them into each other. Like the old saying goes, it's killing two birds with one stone, but in the case of Ape Out, one stone is actually a guard. This is enjoyable not only because it changes up how combat can be approached, but also because it allows you to kill off multiple guards at once. This is especially helpful when you start to encounter more guards than you previously did. Ape Out isn't mechanically complicated, but for a game with very few controls, there's a lot that can be done. Most of this is seen through what you yourself can do, such as tossing enemies into each other, being able to use limbs as a weapon, which manages to simultaneously come off as interesting and disturbing, and eventually seeing that enemies are able to shoot each other. I like how this is handled in Ape Out because it's the kind of game that indirectly tells you this is what you can do, but it leaves things open enough to allow you to let your imagination go wild when it comes to utilizing what you can do in all sorts of situations. I know that there are limits to how far this could go, but it's nice to notice that there's more to it besides tossing enemies into walls. As you play on and realize that there's more to Ape Out, you also start to realize that a lot of thought went into having multiple different playstyles in mind. What I mean is that even if you're pretty much encouraged to go all out and create as much mayhem as possible, you can also approach things in a stealthier manner. That's definitely not possible all the time, seeing as how there are moments where there's too much chaos to deal with, but as I'll discuss later on, some levels were designed in such a way that this playstyle was not only viable, but almost encouraged. Having already mentioned that it's possible to toss enemies into each other, it's worth bringing up that similar actions can be seen elsewhere. It's when flamethrower-wielding enemies are introduced that you see what else is possible in Ape Out. To put it simply, tossing these enemies into others was awesome. It's not only because you managed to take out multiple enemies at once, but also because it was impressive to look at. The flames could also affect you in an interesting way. At times, I'd be set on fire and I noticed that enemies would run away from you, in order to avoid being burned. What I liked was that this could be used offensively and defensively. The point wasn't to be reckless and try to hurt myself, but this was more due to me ending up being hit, and seeing the results of that. I think this is great because I just really like games that are open-ended in one way or another. You give players a basic set of rules and then you see where their imagination will take them. Sometimes this is on purpose and sometimes it isn't, but either way, I like when this is possible. I know that this is probably due to my formative years as a gamer, but I like when games have a point or combo system. It not only makes it clearer that my efforts are adding up to something, but it ignites the more competitive side within me. If I can see that it's possible to one-up someone, even myself, chances are I'll be up for that. On top of that, I'd probably be more willing to kill the remaining enemies in a level if this were included. Even something as simple like X remaining enemies would help towards that. Since I quickly realized that I could beat levels without having to kill all enemies, sometimes I just try to get to the exit as quickly as possible. It wasn't due to having speedrunning in mind, but mainly because I didn't see the point in taking longer than was necessary. I'm sure that devs want gamers to spend as much time as possible playing their game, and this could have been prevented. For the most part, I was satisfied with how combat in Ape Out was handled, but I did have some complaints. The point isn't to try to make this game unforgivably hard, but I thought it was strange that it seems as if there's a bit of a delay between being spotted by enemies and them actually doing something. I don't know if it's meant to convey the idea that the enemies are hesitating, but this stood out to me because of how the rest of the game plays. With how balls to the wall the overall action is, you'd think that the enemies would be as aggressive as possible. I guess it depends on your preferences as a gamer, but longer isn't always better. What I mean is that overall enjoyment isn't simply due to whether or not a game requires the right amount of time to get through. I definitely do want my games to be at least 5 hours, but there are some out there that manage to deliver a memorable and enjoyable experience within an hour, or even less than that. If Ape Out were longer than it is, how the game functions would be greatly altered. What I'm referring to is one area in particular. You get to the point where you're trying to escape from a high-rise building, and it requires you to go from floor to floor. Each floor takes 15 seconds to get through, so if you multiply that by the number of floors that you have to go through, you end up with a decent amount of time. I'm sure that being able to get through one floor within a matter of seconds may turn some of you away, but I don't think it's a big deal. With how the game turns out, you realize that it's more about the quality of the time invested and not the quantity. As I previously mentioned, I like how Ape Out is open-ended in more ways than one. This is also seen with its level design. To an extent, this could be seen in most of the levels, but there are some in particular where it's clear that you'll be better off with a more subdued approach. Initially, stealthy levels in a game like this may seem strange, seeing as how most of the game you're trying to be as chaotic as possible, but it's understandable. On the bright side, it changes things up. The further you get into the game, the more you're up against. It's not only with more enemies that have deadlier weapons, but at one point you even start dealing with artillery attacks. It ultimately depends on what I have to say about a game, but sometimes it's simply because of its length. There have been occasions where I've written a lot about games that were less than 10 hours long, but that's not always the case. With Ape Out, it wasn't too long, but it also wasn't too short. To be more exact, it took me less than 3 hours to beat the main story mode. For some, that's not enough. But you get a lot within a short amount of time, and attempting to unlock all of the achievements helps with that. The option to play on harder difficulty levels can also add to the potential amount of time you spend with Ape Out, but that really depends on you and what you're interested in. Overall, I liked Ape Out a lot. It was visually interesting and it managed to keep me entertained while approaching things with a minimalist mindset. Not only with the art style, but also with the gameplay. Despite only having to use like 3 buttons, Ape Out is just really fun. I paid $5.38 for this game and I feel that I got my money's worth, so I definitely do recommend it. If you liked Hotline Miami, Super Meat Boy, and or One Finger Death Punch, chances are you'll like Ape Out. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.